Tension crackled through the air as Jessica stormed out of the HOA meeting, her face flushed with anger. Clutching the $500 violation notice in her trembling hand, she couldn't believe what had just happened. All she had done was put up a simple bird feeder in her front yard. Yet the HOA board had pounced on her like vultures, citing some obscure bylaw about unapproved structures. Now they were demanding she remove it immediately or face escalating fines. This is ridiculous. She fumed, marching down the pristine sidewalk lined with uniformly trimmed hedges. The sense of control the HOA wielded over her own property made her blood boil. How dare they dictate what she could and couldn't do in her own yard? Reaching her modest townhome, Jessica slammed the front door behind her, nearly rattling the windows. Her husband, Michael, looked up from the couch, brow furrowed with concern. "What happened?" he asked, setting down his laptop. "I thought you were just going to the HOA meeting about the bird feeder." "They fined me $500. Jessica spat, thrusting the violation notice in his face. "Can you believe this? Over a stupid bird feeder." Michael's eyes widened as he scanned the document. $500? That's insane. What's their justification? Some nonsense about it being an unapproved structure, Jessica said, rolling her eyes, as if a bird feeder is equivalent to building a shed or something. Michael shook his head in disbelief. "This is ridiculous. We have to fight this." He set the notice down on the coffee table, his brow furrowing in thought. "Have you tried talking to the board? Explaining that it's just a harmless bird feeder?" Jessica sighed heavily. "Of course I did, but they wouldn't listen. They just kept going on about the rules and how I have to remove it immediately." She threw up her hands in frustration. "I feel like I'm living in a dictatorship." Michael reached out and squeezed her hand reassuringly. "Don't worry, we'll figure this out. There's no way they can justify fining us $500 over a bird feeder." Just then, a loud knock echoed through the house. Jessica's heart raced as she peered through the peephole, only to see two uniformed police officers standing on her doorstep. "Oh my God, Michael, it's the cops," she whispered frantically. "What do I do?" Michael's eyes widened with alarm. "Don't answer it," he murmured. "They can't force their way in without a warrant." Jessica hesitated, fingers trembling on the doorknob. The knocking persisted, growing more insistent. Finally, she took a deep breath and pulled the door open. "Ma'am, we've received a report of an illegal bird feeder on your property," one of the officers said sternly. "We're here to issue a citation and ensure it's removed immediately." Jessica's mouth fell open in disbelief. "You've got to be kidding me," she stammered. "This is completely ridiculous. It's just a bird feeder, for crying out loud." The officer's expression remained impassive. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to remove the feeder, or we'll be forced to issue a fine and potentially make an arrest. Those are the orders we've received from the HOA board." Jessica felt her heart racing, panic rising in her chest. This couldn't be happening. It was all so absurd and unjust. But as the officers stood there, unwavering, she knew she had no choice. Reluctantly, she nodded. "Fine. I'll take it down." Shutting the door, she leaned against it, tears of frustration welling in her eyes. Michael pulled her into a comforting embrace, his own expression one of disbelief and outrage. "This is unbelievable," he murmured. "We can't let them get away with this." Jessica nodded, her mind racing with a mixture of anger and fear. Whatever happened next, she knew she had to fight back against this HOA tyranny, no matter the cost. The next morning, Jessica awoke with a renewed sense of determination. After a restless night of tossing and turning, she had made up her mind. She was not going to let the HOA bully her into removing the bird feeder without a fight. Pulling on a pair of jeans and a t-shirt, she marched downstairs to find Michael already at the kitchen table, laptop open and brow furrowed in concentration. "Good. You're up," he said, glancing up as she entered the room. "I've been doing some research on our options." Jessica grabbed a cup of coffee and joined him, her gaze hopeful. "And? What did you find?" "Well, the good news is that there's a chance we can challenge this on legal grounds," Michael explained, scrolling through a document on the screen. "Apparently, the HOA's bylaws have some loopholes when it comes to harmless, non-invasive structures like bird feeders." Jessica felt a flicker of hope. "So we can fight this?" Michael nodded. "I think so. The key is finding the right legal approach. From what I can tell, we might be able to argue that the feeder is protected under local wildlife conservation laws, since it's providing a food source for native birds." Jessica's eyes widened. "Wait, you mean it's not just about the bird feeder itself?" "Exactly," Michael said, leaning forward. "I did some digging, and it turns out the type of bird that's been using your feeder is actually a protected species in our area." Jessica felt a surge of adrenaline. "So, if we can prove that, the HOA can't fine us?" "Potentially," Michael replied. "But we'll need to act fast. The HOA has already filed the citation, and they're demanding the feeder be removed by the end of the week." Jessica's mind raced with the implications. "Okay, so what's our next step?" "First, we need to get in touch with a local wildlife conservation group," Michael said. "They should be able to help us identify the bird species and provide the necessary documentation to challenge the HOA's claims." Jessica nodded, already reaching for her phone. "I'll make some calls. Who else should we talk to?" "I'd also recommend reaching out to a lawyer who specializes in HOA disputes," Michael advised. "They'll be able to review the bylaws and help us build a strong legal case." Just then, the doorbell rang, causing both of them to jump. Jessica peered through the peephole, her heart sinking as she recognized the HOA board member standing on their doorstep. "It's Mrs. Wilkins," she whispered to Michael. "What do I do?" Michael gave her a reassuring nod. "Answer it. We need to face this head-on." Steeling herself, Jessica pulled open the door, putting on her most polite smile. "Mrs. Wilkins, what can I do for you?" The older woman's expression was stern, her lips pursed in a thin line. "Jessica, I'm here to remind you that the deadline for removing that bird feeder is tomorrow. If it's not gone by then, the HOA will be forced to take further action." Jessica felt her pulse quicken, but she refused to back down. "Actually, Mrs. Wilkins, I've been doing some research, and I believe the bird feeder is protected under local wildlife conservation laws." The HOA board member's eyes narrowed. "I'm sorry, but that's simply not true. The bylaws are clear. Any unapproved structures must be removed, regardless of their purpose." Jessica took a deep breath, steeling herself for the battle ahead. "Well, then I'm afraid we're going to have to disagree on that. I'm not removing the feeder, and I'm prepared to take this to court if necessary." Mrs. Wilkins' lips thinned into a tight, disapproving line. "Very well. I hope you're prepared to face the consequences, Jessica." With that, she turned on her heel and stalked away, leaving Jessica and Michael standing in the doorway, bracing themselves for the fight of their lives. The next few days were a whirlwind of activity as Jessica and Michael scrambled to build their case against the HOA. They reached out to a local wildlife conservation group, who quickly confirmed that the bird species using the feeder was indeed a protected species in their area. "This is great news," Michael exclaimed after getting off the phone with the group. "They're going to provide us with all the documentation we need to prove the feeder is serving a legitimate conservation purpose." Jessica let out a sigh of relief. "That's a huge relief. Now we just need to find a good lawyer to help us navigate the legal side of things." After a few phone calls, they settled on a local attorney named Sarah, who specialized in HOA disputes. When they met with her in her office, she listened intently as they explained the situation, nodding thoughtfully. "Okay, so you've got the conservation angle covered," she said, her brow furrowed in concentration. "That's a great starting point, but we'll still need to build a strong case around the HOA's own bylaws and procedures." Jessica leaned forward, her gaze intense. What do you mean? I thought the protected species thing would be enough to get them to back off. Sarah shook her head. Unfortunately, it's not that simple. HOAs can be notoriously stubborn, and they often try to find loopholes or technicalities to justify their actions, even in the face of clear evidence. Michael frowned. So what do we need to do? First, we need to get a copy of the HOA's bylaws and conduct a thorough review, Sarah explained. There may be provisions that give them more leeway than we'd like, or that could even inadvertently support your case. Jessica nodded, her mind racing. Okay, what else? We'll also need to look into the HOA's enforcement process, Sarah continued. Did they follow the proper procedures in issuing the citation? Were you given adequate notice and opportunity to respond? They gave us less than a week to remove the feeder, Michael interjected. Doesn't that seem unreasonable? Exactly, Sarah said, jotting down a few notes. That could be grounds for challenging the citation on procedural grounds, even if the feeder itself is protected. Jessica felt a surge of hope. So we have a real chance of winning this. Sarah smiled reassuringly. I believe so, but it's going to take some work. We'll need to gather all the necessary documentation, submit formal responses to the HOA, and be prepared to take this to court if necessary. Michael squeezed Jessica's hand. We're ready to do whatever it takes. This is our home, and we're not going to let the HOA bully us out of it. Sarah nodded approvingly. That's the kind of determination I like to see. Now let's get started on building your case. Over the next few days, Jessica and Michael threw themselves into the task, compiling evidence, drafting formal responses, and coordinating with the Wildlife Conservation Group. The closer they got to the deadline, the more intense the pressure became, but they refused to back down. Finally, the day of the deadline arrived, and Jessica and Michael stood side by side on their doorstep, watching as Mrs. Wilkins and the other HOA board members approached, their expressions grim. I see you've chosen to defy our orders, Mrs. Wilkins said, her voice dripping with disdain. Jessica squared her shoulders, her chin held high. We have a strong legal case, and we're prepared to take this to court if necessary. The HOA board members exchanged uneasy glances, and Jessica knew in that moment that the battle had only just begun. The standoff between Jessica and the HOA board members was tense and palpable. Mrs. Wilkins' expression hardened as she glared at the defiant couple. You're making a big mistake, Jessica, she warned. The HOA bylaws are very clear on this matter. If you refuse to remove that bird feeder, we'll have no choice but to issue further fines and take legal action. Jessica lifted her chin, her voice unwavering. I'm sorry, Mrs. Wilkins, but we've done our homework. This bird feeder is protected under local wildlife conservation laws, and we're prepared to take this to court if necessary. Michael stepped forward, his gaze steady. We've consulted with a lawyer, and she's confident we have a strong case. The HOA's own procedures were not properly followed, and the feeder serves a legitimate conservation purpose. Mrs. Wilkins' lips thinned into a tight, disapproving line. We'll see about that. You have until the end of the day to remove that feeder, or you'll be facing serious consequences. With that, the HOA board members turned and marched away, their footsteps echoing on the pristine sidewalk. Jessica and Michael watched them go, their hearts pounding with a mixture of fear and determination. Well, that went about as well as I expected, Jessica sighed, her shoulders slumping slightly. Michael wrapped an arm around her, pulling her close. Hey, we knew this wasn't going to be easy. But we're in the right, and we've got the law on our side. We're not going to back down. Jessica nodded, taking a deep breath. I just hope the lawyer can help us navigate this mess. I'm not sure I have the energy to fight the HOA alone. That's why we've got Sarah on our side, Michael reassured her. She knows what she's doing, and she's going to help us every step of the way. Just then, the doorbell rang, and Jessica's heart raced. Peering through the peephole, she saw a uniformed police officer standing on their doorstep. "It's the cops again," she whispered, her voice trembling. "What do we do?" Michael squeezed her hand reassuringly. "Just stay calm and let me handle this." He pulled open the door, his expression cautious. "Officer, how can I help you?" The officer's face was stern, his gaze unwavering. "Sir, we've received another complaint about an illegal bird feeder on your property. I'm going to have to issue a citation and ask you to remove it immediately." Michael stood his ground, his voice calm and measured. "Officer, I understand your concerns, but this bird feeder is actually protected under local wildlife conservation laws. We've consulted with a lawyer and we're prepared to take this matter to court if necessary." The officer's brow furrowed. "I'm sorry, but I'm just following the orders I've received from the HOA board. If you don't remove the feeder, I'll have to issue a fine and potentially make an arrest." Jessica's heart raced as she watched the exchange, her mind reeling. This couldn't be happening. They had done everything right, and yet the HOA seemed determined to crush them. Michael stood his ground, his voice unwavering. "Officer, I'm going to have to ask you to leave. We're not going to remove the feeder, and we'll be in touch with our lawyer to handle this matter legally." The officer hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "Very well. But I'll be back if the HOA files another complaint." As the officer turned and walked away, Jessica and Michael looked at each other, their faces etched with a mixture of relief and determination. "This isn't over," Jessica whispered, her eyes narrowing. "We're going to fight this to the end." In the days that followed, Jessica and Michael threw themselves into preparing their legal case against the HOA. With the help of their lawyer, Sarah, they pored over the HOA's bylaws, uncovering several potential loopholes and procedural missteps that could work in their favor. The key is going to be proving that the HOA's actions were both unreasonable and a violation of their own rules. Sarah explained during one of their strategy sessions. "We need to show that the bird feeder is not only protected by conservation laws, but that the HOA's response was disproportionate and heavy-handed." Jessica nodded, her brow furrowed in concentration. "Okay, so what's our next step?" "First, we need to formally respond to the HOA's latest citation," Sarah said, handing them a draft letter. "In this, we'll outline all the evidence we've gathered, from the wildlife conservation documentation to the issues with their enforcement process." Michael scanned the letter, his expression thoughtful. "And this will give us a stronger legal standing when we take this to court." "Exactly," Sarah replied. "By establishing a clear paper trail and forcing the HOA to respond to our arguments, we're setting the stage for a more favorable legal outcome." Jessica took a deep breath, her gaze resolute. "Okay, let's do it. I'm ready to send this off." Over the next few days, Jessica and Michael worked tirelessly to finalize their response, checking and double-checking every detail. Finally, when the letter was ready, they handed it off to Sarah to deliver to the HOA board. "Now we wait," Sarah said, giving them a reassuring smile. "The HOA has a certain amount of time to respond, and that's when things will really start to heat up." The waiting was agonizing, with Jessica and Michael constantly on edge, wondering what the HOA's next move would be. But just when they were starting to lose hope, a registered letter arrived, bearing the HOA's seal. "This is it," Michael said, his voice tense as he ripped open the envelope. As they read through the HOA's response, their faces darkened with anger and disbelief. "They're doubling down," Jessica said, her voice trembling. "They're claiming the bird feeder is an eyesore and a nuisance, and they're threatening to take us to court if we don't remove it immediately." Michael clenched his fists, his knuckles turning white. "I can't believe they're doing this. After everything we've shown them, they're still refusing to back down." Sarah let out a heavy sigh. "I was afraid they might do something like this. The HOA can be incredibly stubborn when they feel their authority is being challenged." Jessica felt her heart racing, a mixture of fear and determination coursing through her veins. So what do we do now? Now, we take them to court, Sarah said, her expression resolute. We've got a strong case, and we're going to fight this tooth and nail. The HOA's actions are clearly unreasonable and a violation of your rights. Michael nodded, his gaze unwavering. We're ready. Whatever it takes, we're not going to let them bully us out of our own home. As they prepared to file their lawsuit, Jessica couldn't help but feel a twinge of nervousness. The HOA had deep pockets and a reputation for being relentless in their pursuit of power. But with Sarah by their side and the law on their side, she knew they had a fighting chance. This was a battle she was determined to win, no matter the cost. The day of the court hearing arrived, and Jessica and Michael found themselves sitting in the imposing courtroom, their lawyer, Sarah, by their side. The air was thick with tension as the HOA board members filed in, their expressions grim and unyielding. As the judge took his seat, Sarah rose to her feet, her voice clear and confident. Your Honor, we are here today to challenge the actions of the Oakwood Hills Homeowners Association and their unjust treatment of my clients, Jessica and Michael Hernandez. She began laying out their case, meticulously detailing the timeline of events, the evidence they had gathered, and the legal grounds on which they were challenging the HOA's actions. Jessica watched with bated breath, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew they had a strong case, but the weight of the situation was overwhelming. This wasn't just about a bird feeder, it was about their right to live in their own home without being subjected to the tyrannical whims of the HOA. As Sarah's arguments unfolded, the HOA's representatives grew increasingly agitated. Mrs. Wilkins, the board president, repeatedly interrupted, her voice shrill and indignant. Your Honor, this is clearly a frivolous attempt to undermine the authority of the HOA, she huffed. The bylaws are clear, and this bird feeder is an unauthorized structure that must be removed. The judge, a stern-faced man with a graying mustache, held up a hand, silencing her. Mrs. Wilkins, I will thank you to let the counsel for the Hernandez family make their case without interruption. Jessica felt a surge of relief, but it was short-lived as the HOA's lawyer, a slick-looking man in an expensive suit, rose to his feet. Your Honor, the Hernandez family is trying to use a technicality to circumvent the clear rules of our community, he said, his voice dripping with condescension. This bird feeder is not only an eyesore, but it also poses a potential threat to the property values and overall aesthetics of the neighborhood. Michael's hand tightened around Jessica's, and she could feel the tension radiating from him. She knew this was a crucial moment, and they couldn't afford to back down. Sarah stood her ground, her gaze unwavering. Your Honor, the Hernandez family has provided ample evidence that the bird feeder in question is protected under local wildlife conservation laws. Furthermore, the HOA's own bylaws allow for harmless, non-invasive structures such as this one. Their actions in issuing fines and citations are a clear violation of the law and their own governing documents. The judge listened intently, his brow furrowed in concentration. Finally, he raised a hand, silencing the lawyers. It's clear to me that there are valid arguments on both sides of this dispute, he said, his voice grave. However, I'm not convinced that the HOA has acted in a reasonable and proportionate manner, given the evidence presented. Jessica felt a flicker of hope as the judge continued. I'm going to issue a temporary restraining order prohibiting the HOA from taking any further action against the Hernandez family until I can review all of the evidence and make a final ruling. Both sides will have the opportunity to present their case in greater detail at a follow-up hearing. As the courtroom erupted in murmurs, Jessica squeezed Michael's hand, a small smile spreading across her face. They had won the first round, but she knew the battle was far from over. In the weeks that followed the initial court hearing, Jessica and Michael found themselves embroiled in an increasingly intense legal battle with the Oakwood Hills Homeowners Association. The HOA, determined to assert its authority, had hired a team of high-powered lawyers who seemed intent on burying the Hernandez family in a mountain of paperwork and legal jargon. But Jessica and Michael, with the steadfast guidance of their lawyer, Sarah, refused to back down. They pored over the HOA's bylaws, dug deeper into the local wildlife conservation laws, and meticulously documented every interaction they had with the board members. "They're trying to overwhelm us with sheer legal firepower," Sarah explained during one of their strategy sessions. "But we have the facts on our side, and we're going to use that to our advantage." Jessica nodded, her expression grim. "I just hope the judge sees it that way. The HOA seems to have a lot of sway in this community." Michael reached over and squeezed her hand reassuringly. "We've got a strong case, Jess, and we're not going to let them bully us into giving up." As the follow-up hearing approached, the tension in the Hernandez household reached a fever pitch. Jessica found herself constantly on edge, jumping at every knock on the door or phone call. The thought of losing their home, of being forced to remove the bird feeder that had become a symbol of their resistance, was almost too much to bear. But when the day of the hearing arrived, Jessica and Michael steeled themselves, determined to face the HOA's onslaught head-on. As the proceedings began, Sarah once again laid out their case with meticulous precision, presenting a mountain of evidence and legal arguments. The HOA's lawyers, however, refused to back down, launching a barrage of objections and counterarguments. The judge, a stoic and impartial figure, listened intently, his brow furrowed in concentration. Jessica watched, her heart pounding, as the battle of wills unfolded before her. Finally, after hours of heated debate, the judge raised a hand, signaling for silence. "I've heard the arguments from both sides, and I must say, this is a complex and challenging case," he said, his voice grave. "On the one hand, the Hernandez family has presented a compelling case that the bird feeder in question is protected under local wildlife conservation laws, and that the HOA's actions have been unreasonable and disproportionate." Jessica felt a flicker of hope, but it was quickly extinguished as the judge continued. "However, I must also acknowledge the HOA's concerns about maintaining the aesthetic and property values of the community. Their bylaws do appear to grant them a significant degree of authority over the appearance of individual properties." The HOA's lawyers seemed to perk up at this, but the judge raised a hand, silencing them. "That being said, I'm not convinced that the HOA has acted in good faith or followed proper procedures in this case. The evidence suggests that they have been overly aggressive and heavy-handed in their approach." Jessica felt her pulse quicken as the judge's gaze settled on her and Michael. "Therefore, I am ruling in favor of the Hernandez family. The bird feeder may remain, and the HOA is prohibited from issuing any further fines or citations related to this matter." A surge of relief washed over Jessica, and she felt Michael's arms wrap around her in a tight embrace. They had won. Against all odds, they had stood up to the HOA and emerged victorious. As the news of the judge's ruling spread through the Oakwood Hills community, the reaction was a mixed bag. Some residents celebrated the Hernandez family's triumph, seeing it as a victory against the perceived overbearing control of the HOA. Others, however, expressed outrage, viewing the decision as a threat to the carefully curated aesthetic and property values that the HOA was meant to protect. Mrs. Wilkins, the HOA board president, was particularly incensed, her face flushed with anger as she addressed a hastily called meeting. "This is an outrage," she exclaimed, her voice shrill and indignant. "The judge has completely undermined our authority and set a dangerous precedent. We can't allow this kind of defiance to go unchecked." Some of the other board members nodded in agreement, their brows furrowed with concern. But a few dissenting voices spoke up, cautioning against further escalation. "Maybe we should take a step back and reconsider our approach," one member suggested tentatively. "This has clearly become a major issue in the community, and we need to be mindful of the optics." Mrs. Wilkins, however, was having none of it. Optics don't matter when it comes to upholding the integrity of our neighborhood," she spat. "We're going to appeal this decision, and we're going to fight tooth and nail to have that bird feeder removed, no matter what it takes. As the meeting drew to a close, the board members filed out, their expressions a mix of determination and trepidation. Jessica and Michael, who had been closely monitoring the proceedings from afar, felt a sense of unease settle over them. "I have a bad feeling about this," Jessica murmured, her gaze fixed on the retreating figures. Michael squeezed her hand reassuringly. "Don't worry, Jess. We've got the law on our side. They can't just ignore the judge's ruling." But as the days passed, it became clear that the HOA had no intention of backing down. They filed an appeal, and the legal battle was reignited, with both sides digging in deeper than ever before. The stress and strain began to take a toll on Jessica and Michael, who found themselves constantly on edge, jumping at every knock on the door or phone call. The thought of losing their home, their sanctuary, was almost too much to bear. One evening, as they sat in their living room, staring at the bird feeder that had become the center of this bitter conflict, Jessica let out a weary sigh. "I'm starting to wonder if it's all worth it," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. "Maybe we should just give in and take the feeder down, avoid all this hassle." Michael looked at her, his expression one of surprise and concern. "Jess, you can't be serious. We've come this far, and we can't just give up now." Jessica shook her head, her eyes brimming with tears. "I'm so tired, Michael. I feel like we're fighting a losing battle, and I don't know how much more I can take." Pulling her into a tight embrace, Michael held her close, his own heart heavy with the weight of their struggle. "I know it's hard, but we can't give up. This isn't just about the bird feeder anymore. It's about standing up for our rights, our home. We can't let the HOA win." Jessica nodded, wiping away her tears. "You're right. We've come too far to back down now." She took a deep breath, her gaze resolute. "Let's keep fighting." As they turned their attention back to the bird feeder, Jessica couldn't help but feel a renewed sense of determination. Whatever happened next, she knew they would face it together, united in their fight for justice.